I am Susan Murray. I'm the Executive Director of African Journals Online. Welcome to our ongoing webinar program for 2024. Please do keep your microphone and camera turned off for the duration. It just helps the presenter concentrate. Usually Dr. Kylie van Zyl, who is AJOL's assessment officer, hosts our webinars. She is on leave at the moment, so I have stepped in. Welcome to everybody joining. There are still additional people stepping in to the webinar, so I'm just going slowly with this introduction. So the purpose of today's webinar, I see someone has raised a hand. Please, would you, rather than raising hands, type any questions you might have into the chat box on the right-hand side. You will see the icon at the bottom of your screen at the right-hand side. And we answer questions at the end of the presentation of our guest speaker. The purpose of today's webinar is to familiarize journals that are publishing from within the African continent, and also obviously anybody else who's interested enough to join us this afternoon, with the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is an international entity that AJOL has worked with for many years. We would like to make everybody aware of the beneficial aspects of African published journals being included on both the AJOL platform and applying for inclusion and assessment into the Directory of Open Access Journals. We very much encourage our existing open access partners to apply to the DOAJ if you haven't already. And hopefully you will have a good understanding of how to do so by the end of today's webinar. So we are very fortunate today to have a senior staff member of the DOAJ, Directory of Open Access Journals, joining us to present and explain exactly what the DOAJ is for, how to apply, and the benefits of being included. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Judith Barnsby, who is the head of editorial for the DOAJ. She has 25 years of experience in scholarly publishing, has a wealth of knowledge to share with us this afternoon. So please do type your questions into the chat box, and we will have time at the end of Judith's presentation today to be able to go through your questions of clarification and have some discussion time. So Judith, please do go ahead. Thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan, for the opportunity to be presenting here. I'm just going to maximize my slides and hopefully everyone will be able to see those. So yes, hi everyone. I'm really glad to be here. And as Susan says, I'm just going to take you through why we think it's a good idea for African journals to be indexed in DOAJ and give you some idea of how you go about that and give you the opportunity to ask any questions about our criteria and the way that we assess journals. So I shall just move right on to talk about, why you should apply. I've got a little statistics of the African journals already in DOAJ. I'm going to go through the application and review process, some key points in that application, and then what to do if you feel that you're ready to apply. So first of all, you're hopefully hosted on AJOL. Why do you need to apply to DOAJ? What's in it for you? So there are some clear benefits of being indexed in DOAJ. And one of the big ones of those is that you will find that the journal is indexed in a lot more search engines and indexes, because DOAJ has a really wide range of partners who take our metadata. So if you can, once you're indexed, if you can supply article metadata, those articles will be able to be found in lots of other indexes as well as DOAJ. So this gives the journals indexed in DOAJ a higher profile, especially if they're local journals, and an enhanced reputation and impact. It helps you to attract more readers and more authors from around the world. And of course, there is no charge to any journal for either applying to be included or when the journal is indexed. So that's important because people often think that there is a charge. So as of, I think, 2 days ago, when I got these statistics, there were just over 20,800 journals in DOAJ from 134 countries. And that represents 80 different languages that those journals are published in. Two-thirds of those journals in DOAJ don't charge anything for inclusion. So it's quite important that we feel it's important for us to support Diamond open access journals, and particularly journals that are not produced by commercial entities. So that's something that we're very keen to do. We have got journals from all over the world. We have got journals from, I think it's 22 countries in Africa, but as you can see from the little gaps in places, that we don't necessarily have journals from everywhere in Africa. And I did some statistics yesterday. And in fact, what I was really pleased to discover was that since the beginning of 2022, we've actually doubled the number of African journals that are indexed in DOAJ. So there's about 537, I think it was, when I looked. It's still not as many as we'd like, of course, but I think there's been some good progress in the last couple of years. And I think we'd really like to build on that and include more journals from Africa as soon as we can, really. Last year, one of my colleagues did a series of what she called journal stories to celebrate our 20 years of existence. And one of the journals that we looked at was Physics Access, which is from Nigeria. And Dr. Daniel, who's the editor-in-chief, he told her that since the journal's been in DOAJ, they've had authors from different parts of the world sending us articles to be considered for the journal, and that's really helped in the development of the journal. So that was a really nice thing to hear about helping to grow that particular journal. So I'm just going to talk about what the application review process involves. So as the name implies, we're the directory of open access journals. So our criteria for inclusion means that we accept fully open access journals only, no hybrid journals, no subscription journals, no journals where some content is open access and other content is not available. The journals should be peer reviewed and they should be active. And we expect a journal to be publishing at least 5 articles a year. There is a detailed guide to applying, so I'm not going to go through all of the criteria, but it's quite similar to the STAR system at AJOL. So many of the criteria will be very familiar to you if you're familiar with that process. So last year we had 8,000 applications to be included in DOAJ, and 4,000 requests to update journals that were already indexed. And we are accepting just under a quarter of those applications. There's 12 people in my team who handle the applications, and we have more than 100 volunteer editors who help us with language skills and in particular geographical regions. So we have a couple of groups of volunteers who work with us who are based in Africa. And so if you apply to us, it's likely that one of those volunteer editors will review your application. So just again, some stats. As you can see from this chart, we've gone from just over 5,000 applications submitted in 2018 to, as I say, 8,000 it was last year. So that's holding fairly steady over the last 3 years. But as you can see, the proportion of those that have been accepted is actually reducing a little bit. So our criteria are quite, we have a quite wide and quite robust, but we hope that they should be achievable for journals wherever they are in the world. There shouldn't need to be any technological considerations that mean a journal with little budget shouldn't be able to be accepted. So at the moment we are taking about 3 months on average from the time an application is submitted to when a decision is made to accept it or reject it. So that's how long you should expect. It may not take that long, but that's to be expected when you apply. And we had a quote from one of our successful applicants that they found that it was quite difficult but doable, and the DOAJ team was there to support them as they did that. So we are able to help and advise where needed. So there's 5 steps in the process, from the application through the checks that are done internally and by our volunteers. The final decision is made by a managing editor in our team, so someone like me, and then we provide feedback to the publisher if that application was unsuccessful. So the first thing that happens after you apply is that our triage team will make some initial checks, and these are the things that you need to make sure are correct for the journal to pass through this triage stage. So you need to have an ISSN, and that needs to be registered. The journal website needs to be up, and it needs to be available to anybody, anywhere, so that we can review the website and we can see that the full text articles are available and that they can be accessed without any requirement for registration or without a delay after publication. The other things that they check are whether copyright and licensing information is available, because that's important for open access, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So if you've made an application and you've passed this stage, then all the applications that pass that stage are reviewed. And be aware that actually that triage team rejects, I think, about 50% of what comes in. So quite a lot of the applications are not things that meet all those initial criteria. So we check the journal against our criteria for inclusion, which are listed in the guide to applying that I mentioned earlier. If there's a query or something that we think is missing or may not be correct, then we can go back to that publisher or that editor and we can ask them, we're not clear about what this policy means, or there's something that you should include here that you haven't. We may also identify where there's areas of concern if we think that a publisher is actually predatory at that stage, and we can put that to one side for further action. And so the volunteers or the members of staff will at that stage recommend to accept or reject after they've resolved the queries, if there were any, with the publisher. Then the final decision is made by one of my team. We review that application and the comments that have been made by the editor. We may find that there's something that we're not happy with, or we have queries about, so that may go back for further review, and we make that final decision, which may be the same as the recommendation from the editor, but it may not. So if that journal is accepted for inclusion, which is great, an automated email will be sent immediately, and that journal will appear in DOAJ at that point. So if you're accepted today, your journal will be seen in DOAJ today. And if a journal's been rejected, there will be an email sent, depending on how much needs to be described. It may be one of our automated emails, or it may be a manual email written by one of the team that explains issues that led to rejection. And because we have so many applications coming in, we ask for the publisher to wait for 6 months before applying again. And that is simply so that we can get through all of those applications that we're seeing, and not dealing with multiple reapplications from a journal that's been unsuccessful. So some of the common reasons for rejection, which that you should be aware of, is if some of the full text articles can't be accessed. For instance, you've got a contents list and you've got full text files for most of them, but not all of them. What we're expecting is that that journal has the content available once it's published. So we don't expect to find some stuff that's missing or that is otherwise inaccessible. Sometimes the links given in the application don't lead to the right information. So we ask for, where's your copyright policy? But you put in a URL and that goes somewhere else, and we can't find the copyright policy. That might lead to rejection because we can't see it. There's some information that we need to be available on the website so that authors and readers can find it. So that would be things like copyright, licensing, peer review process, any charges that are applied. We want to see that, and that might lead to rejection if a lot of that required information is missing. I say, if the licensing copyright information is there, but it's unclear or it's contradictory, then that is another reason for rejection. And also then we look at things like peer review issues and endogeny, which is the number of papers that are written by members of the editorial board. So if we feel that too many papers are being published in the journal that are from people associated with the journal, that's not seen as best practice. And we have a guideline on that, which is 25%. So if we see more than 25% of the issues with endogeny, then that can lead to rejection too. So I'm going to briefly go over the key points that you should be looking out for if you decide to apply to DOAJ. So the first thing is, a journal doesn't appear in DOAJ because we want it to. All journals from any publisher apply for inclusion. So that's the first step, is the application form. and you need to answer all the questions in the application form, unless they are marked as optional. Although some of the answers can be no, you don't feel that you need to answer all the questions yes in order to get in. Yes.
Judith, sorry to interrupt you. There are some participants who are saying that the slides are static
Oh,
or frozen
are you seeing
for
them?
them. I can see them perfectly, so I'm not sure. It's just been mentioned by a couple of people.
Ah.
So
I wonder if it's a connectivity issue that they're.
yeah, I think it's maybe on the side of the users, of the participants reporting the problem, because other people are saying now that it's okay for them and they can see
Okay.
the slide. So please continue. Sorry for that disruption.
Okay. I think maybe the best thing for people who are having that problem is to watch the video afterwards.
Sure.
Because I think if you're seeing the slides okay, and they're certainly, you know, I'm obviously following through as I'm speaking, so but that might be the best thing. But obviously, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to interrupt me with questions if there are some at this point. Otherwise, I will carry on.
Please do.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through essentially the individual pages of the application form. There are 7 pages of the application form, but I think it's a lot less scary than that sounds. The first page on the application form just asks for your compliance to open access. So does the journal adhere to DOAJ's definition of open access, which is freely available to all with a license? Essentially, that is the definition. So to qualify, you must answer yes to that question, and you can't get any further if you answer no. We ask for you to display the open access statement. So say this is an open access journal, which means that it can be accessed by anybody, and you can reuse the content according to this Creative Commons license. We also ask for the date the journal began publishing in open access, and that is either the date it started, if it's always been open access, or the date it changed, if it used to be a subscription journal and it's moved to open access, or it used to be a free journal and it's now started to implement a license. So that's a pretty simple page, and hopefully that won't cause you any issues. Then we ask for a bit of information about the journal. So the journal title and any alternative titles. So for instance, if you have a multilingual journal, you can have the alternative title in another language. We ask for the homepage URL, the ISSNs, which we will check as part of our triage process. Enter some subject keywords about the subject covered by the journal, say medicine, physics, social sciences, whatever. The languages that you accept papers in, and I think the form accepts up to 5 languages, which actually isn't enough, because I had a journal yesterday, I think, that accepted 10 languages. So that might be something we need to fix. And then the name of the publisher and any other organization that is involved with the journal. So again, that should be pretty simple information that you already hold about the journal. So we get on to the things that are a bit more complicated, which is copyright and licensing. So we ask about what license is permitted by the journal. So that is your decision. We don't have any viewpoint on what license you should allow. So the most, actually, I've got a little slide about licenses, but there are 6 Creative Commons licenses of different openness, and you can choose any of those. You can allow an author to pick from any of those. It's up to you. And so we ask for the licenses that you use in the journal. We ask if that license is embedded or displayed in the full text articles. It's great practice if you can do that. It's not a problem if you can't. But it's useful for you. So if somebody takes a PDF file and they store it on their own computer, if that PDF file has the license embedded in it, then that user will always know, for instance, if it has a non-commercial license, that they can't reuse that content commercially. So it is a useful thing for you as a publisher and editor to have the license included in those full text articles. We won't reject a journal if they're not done. And we also ask whether authors retain copyright and whether they retain publishing rights without restriction. Again, that best practice is yes. We will still accept journals where the answer is no. And I will talk a bit more about that because that is a super complicated issue, which we find many publishers don't really understand, particularly ones who have moved from a subscription basis, you know, like European and American journals. We find they get quite confused about that. So as I mentioned, there are 6 different licenses that Creative Commons use. There's no charge to use these. They're very widely used in publishing, and they range from the most open license, which is the top one, CC BY, which basically says anyone can reuse this content. You've just got to say it was originally by the author. And that can be used for pretty much any purpose. And then there's different things that can be added to that license to make it less open, going down to the bottom one, which is CC BY NCND, which means no commercial use and no derivative works, which means somebody can reuse this only for non-commercial purposes and only in its exact form as it was published. You can't kind of tweak it or adjust it in any way. So, as I said, DOAJ makes no demands on a publisher for which license you choose. It's totally up to you. We've had people who assume you have to use CC BY because it is regarded as, you know, the best license. But if you are concerned about other people using the content published in your journal commercially, then you should use a non-commercial license. You know, we would not want to make any demands on you as to how your content should be reused. So any of those are fine. And then we talk about rights. So the best practice in open access is that the author retains the copyright of the paper that they've written. If that's the case, and they have signed a non-exclusive license, or they've given a non-exclusive license to the publisher, what that means is they retain all of the rights of that paper, and the CC license that they've applied to it applies to the readers and also to the publisher. So if you publish under a non-commercial license, for instance, that copyright owner or the author can still use their work commercially. They can give the publisher a non-exclusive license of those commercial rights, so the publisher can also use it commercially. The readers can't because they apply to the have to use the work under that license. But the author retains all the rights, and that is the best situation really for the author. But the author can license those rights or transfer copyright to the publisher. If the publisher is the copyright owner and they apply a CC license, then that means that the license applies to the author as well as the readers. So if that CC license is commercial, that means that the author can't use their own work commercially. And that is really the main difference. It's all about author rights. In all cases, the readers must use the work according to which CC license applies. So again, although it's best practice for the author to retain all the rights, if you wish to require that the author transfers copyright to you, that will not stop your journal being indexed in DOAJ. And you can ask me after the session if you've got any questions about copyright and licensing, because I am aware that many publishers find this a really difficult subject, and it's one of the things we spend most time having to explain to people of why we've rejected their journal. So any questions you ask on that will be fine. We then ask about editorial policies. So we ask about the type of peer review. Do you use open peer review? Do you use blind or anonymous peer review? So we ask for that to be included in the application form. We recommend that you use some kind of plagiarism checking. Again, we're aware that most of those services cost money, so we highly recommend it, but we don't require it. Other things really are information that you should always have available on your website anyway: the aims and scope, a list of your editorial board, and we ask for you to include the affiliations of those board members, because that's useful for readers to know where your board are based. Instructions for authors, of course, and then we ask you to just quote for us the average number of weeks from the submission of a paper to the publication of a paper. And that's just for informational purposes. We put that in the DOAJ record so people have got some idea of how quickly their paper would be published. So just a little bit about peer review. As I said, we expect that the journals in DOAJ are peer reviewed. So not everything will be peer reviewed. For instance, you might publish news items or book reviews that are not reviewed, but all research articles must be peer reviewed. Best practice is that at least 2 independent reviewers will assess each article. And we ask that guest edited content like special issues must adhere to the same standards and be under the oversight of the editor-in-chief. That's a fairly new thing that we added to our criteria because of the fairly well documented special issue problems that happened with a number of really large commercial publishers who were not operating sufficient editorial oversight over their special issues. And again, to minimize endogeny, so I said 25% of the papers in an issue can have one of the editorial team as an author, but please try and keep that to a fairly low level, because it's good for you to have a wide authorship, and that looks good for your journal. So we ask, I think there's 7 different boxes in the application form, so for different types of peer review. So anonymous is what used to be called single blind peer review, and double blind. We will accept journals that allow peer review post publication, and peer review that is open so that those reports are published. So again, we do not make any demands on you in terms of the type of peer review. The only thing is that if it's editorial review, that's generally not peer review, but review by the editors, and we allow that only for journals in the arts and humanities, where that is a fairly widespread process. So getting towards the end of the application form now, we just ask if the journal asks for a fee for publishing an article. And so we ask what the APC is, and for a link to the website where that's stated. And if you don't charge any fees to authors, that is absolutely great, but please state that on your website for transparency, rather than just assuming people will know that, because we do find that some less reputable publishers don't say anything about charges, and then, you know, some poor author publishes a paper and they hit them with a charge that they weren't expecting. So this is great for transparency. If you charge a fee, please state if there are any waivers or any other fees that apply. And then the last page of information that we ask for you is about some best practice processes. And I want to stress that these are not required for inclusion in DOAJ. These are best practice things that it would be great if all publishers could do. But we understand that there are some reasons why publishers can't always do this. And so you can answer no to every question on this page, and that will not affect whether you can be in DOAJ. So that is long-term preservation, which is, of course, highly recommended in case anything happens to your website. Your policy for what authors can do with their papers, you know, can they put them in their institutional repository or subject-based repositories? Unique identifiers, that is things like DOI for articles and ORCID for authors, and whether your references are open. Again, do not worry about those. Any doubt whether you conform to those things, just answer no, and there's no problem. We will always check anyway that whether we will find, you know, the journal in an archive. And sometimes people say no when we do find it. So again, that's no problem. So page 7 is just to go over the form and then submit it. So once you've done that, or before you do that, really. So if you feel that you can apply, check the guide to applying to see if there are any queries or concerns you have about whether you meet all the criteria. And you can ask us, you can ask me, you can ask our help desk if you have any questions about whether your journal meets our criteria. And then you can register for a DOAJ account, complete the application form, and then you will go through that process that I've already described. One thing that's quite important is save a draft of the application form. Maybe you won't be able to fill it in all at once, but once you've got the application form, you can save it as a draft and you can go back to it at any time. So don't feel that you have to start it and finish it all at once, which was what used to happen years ago on our website. But now you can save a draft, and I think that will help you if you need to check something when you get to that section and you're not quite sure, or you need to add something to the website because it doesn't say anything on the website at the moment. And so there is support available, and we are happy to answer questions about the process or the form or what the criteria means. As I said, there's the guide to applying, which I've mentioned several times already. There's a publisher information page on our website. There's a PDF file of the questions in the application, so you can download that for reference if you want to. And there is an application guide for journals that are hosted on OJS. So that's quite helpful. It tells you where the information is that you need. And that's quite a useful guide if you're hosted on OJS. As I said, there's the help desk. That is, people in our team are always monitoring that, so they will be able to answer your questions if you have them. And there's some other resources to support journal editors. The Open Access Journals Toolkit, which was launched, I believe, last year by OASPA and DOAJ. So that has got useful information about various aspects of open access publishing. So I do advise you to have a look at that if you have any questions about any aspects of publishing. And there's a forum called Place, which is not specifically open access, but again, DOAJ and OASPA were involved in that alongside COPE, which is the Committee on Publishing Ethics, and Crossref. So if you have questions about DOIs, you have questions about open access, you have questions about publishing ethics, you can log into that and you can ask a question and someone will answer your question for you. And I was involved in the launch of that, so I've been involved in answering questions on that. And there are places for you to go if you have questions about publishing. And I hope that that's not scared you off too much and that you will want to apply to DOAJ, because I think it will be a really positive thing to have more African journals, and we can show the quality of journals that are available from other parts of the world that some other databases don't cover very well. So please let me know if you've got any questions, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Super. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Judith. We have loads of questions.
I thought we might.
And I see some applause coming.
Oh, thank you so much.
for your presentation. Right. So I'm just copying the last of the questions in the chat over into the Q&A. And we're going to go through the questions that came in via text in the Q&A before we attempt to have any further discussions, so as to make sure that those earlier questions are covered. So Judith, actually, this is interestingly seems to be a question for AJOL rather than the DOAJ. I wasn't sure which one. It was from Adewale Adeyeye, who said one of the journals that they managed was recently there's a misspelling here, but I'm thinking delisted from DOAJ. How do we reapply again?
Okay.
I have in the chat shared the application guide URL, as well as the link to the DOAJ application form itself. So the people do have access to that already, Judith, but carry on.
Excellent. Well, if a journal's been delisted, there's usually one of two reasons for that. So one is that we have reviewed the journal again and it doesn't meet our current criteria, which we sometimes see because if a journal was accepted into DOAJ several years ago, it may be that it's moved website and some of the information is missing, or that it doesn't meet some of our stricter criteria that we have in place now. So if that's the case, then you should be able to apply again after 6 months. If the journal was found to have any issues around publishing integrity or some concerns on that score, then the journal will probably have been excluded for a year or more, in which case you would need to wait that length of time before applying again. If a journal has been excluded, there is an appeals process. So if you feel it was unfair, you can come back to us. And if you provide evidence that we can consider, then we will look at that decision and see if the correct decision was made. So it kind of depends which of those applies to the journal.
Thank you very much for that clear answer. AJOL is much the same. We do sometimes suspend journal partners on the platform where we have received repeated complaints from users or librarians about the journal. We will go and reassess them and do a huge amount of research and background checks in much the same way that the DOAJ spends a lot of their time on to make sure that the decision is correct. And we do provide feedback to the journals as well on that one. Right, next question. If the journal is paid for before publishing, does that mean it can be called an open access journal? I'm thinking that that's a straightforward yes. That's an APC or gold open access journal.
If that's the case that the author pays, then yes, it is qualified. If the question means something different to that, then I'm not sure. But yes.
Yeah. Thanks. That's how I read it. Next question. I noted one of the criteria was for the journal to have its own website. Does this include journals publishing on AJOL only?
That is an excellent question. And yes, that would be fine. If a journal doesn't have another website, but it's just on AJOL, that we can certainly consider those journals.
Right. Then the next question, I think, Judith, you've answered through your help desk email address provision. The strict application of inclusion criteria is discouraging, especially the 6-month rule when the rejection reasons concern only a minor flaw on our website. After 2 rejections, we're hesitating to apply again. We'd love a contact person at the DOAJ who can guide us through the submission process.
Yes, I understand. Yes, I totally understand that can be really frustrating. I think what would be useful, I suppose, is for you to think about the issues that were raised in the previous 2 rejections and ensure that those are resolved. And yes, ask us if there's any specific questions. I think we can, if you email the help desk, I think they can advise and they can pass it to me if needed.
Great. The next question, scrolling back up. Yo.
So I just see the question about the journal that was delisted for unclear licensing. So I think so that would be something where we would be able to review that journal again. And if you have resolved the licensing issue, if you're not sure, you can ask us what we mean by that. But yes, you'll be able to apply again 6 months after the delisting.
Right. Next question was, how long does it take from application to final decision? Judith, I think you mentioned an average of 3 months.
I mentioned an average of 3 months. It could be quicker depending on who is assigned to the journal, and well, it could be quicker if you know, rejection is very obvious, unfortunately. But yeah, we expect to to finish all applications within, I would say, within 4 months. At the moment, now we're in August, we are working on applications at the moment that were submitted in May. And those are the slowest applications. So we are always kind of pushing the slower applications. So it may be that your application would be done a lot quicker than that. We just kind of try and make sure that things don't get left behind. So at the moment, I'm aware that we have a few applications from April and some applications from May that we are trying to close at the moment. So I think 3 months is still quite a good guide. And what we say at the help desk is, if you haven't heard anything, and don't ask us until 3 months are up, because the chances are your application is under review. And thank you for putting the help desk email in the chat.
Sure. Right, and then the question after that was, I'm just going to kind of rephrase a little bit. How many years must a journal have been open access for in order to qualify for inclusion on the DOAJ? So perhaps they've been in a subscription journal and have flipped to becoming an open access journal, gold or diamond. For how long must they have been open access before they are eligible?
That's an excellent question. We actually don't require that to be a very, very long time. So if a journal is brand new, we ask that it's published at least 10 articles. So it could be, you could apply for a new journal, within the same year that it's been launched. So that also applies to a journal that has flipped. So once the journal has flipped from a closed access to an open access, once it's published 10 open access articles in that new volume, you can apply. So we have journals, most of flipped journals are from the larger, commercial publishers in Europe, and they are usually submitting, 6 months, say, after they've moved to open access.
Great, thanks. Then there is another question about plagiarism software. Is there any specifically advised plagiarism software to choose in order for a journal to check for plagiarism of submitted articles? And a follow-on question from somebody else, is there any free plagiarism software?
I believe there is some free plagiarism software. I'm not sure how good it is. I'm not an expert on plagiarism software. I think most journals who are registered with Crossref will be using the cross-check service that they offer. But of course there is a cost, both for joining Crossref and for using that service. So I don't know if anyone else has any idea. I will check and see, because I have colleagues who probably know more about free plagiarism software than I do. So I will see what I can find out, and then we can follow up.
Another helpful tip is, if you're working out of a university, ask your librarian if your university already subscribes to some kind of commercial type of plagiarism software, because in that case, you can probably use your university's Turnitin subscription.
That's a really good idea. And Turnitin is the basis of the Crossref system as well. So you'll be using the same kind of thing.
AJOL in our resources section does have some free plagiarism checkers listed. We haven't revisited those for a long time though. So maybe just do a Google search of your own to try and look for some and evaluate how good they are from feedback on those. So another interesting question coming up. In what ways is the DOAJ different from other platforms or indexing services?
That's a good question. Well, we are probably the I would say I won't say that we're the biggest database of open access of journals, but we are the most we're the one where we look at quality, where we have criteria. There are other databases that don't. And if you were comparing DOAJ with the commercial databases like Scopus and Web of Science, there is quite a lot of sort of overlap in terms of the open access journals that we all cover, but we cover far more than they do that are in the Global South, that are in languages other than English, because we don't require English. You know, if your journal is completely in French, we don't require any English. If your journal is completely in Arabic, we don't require any English. We don't need English abstracts or titles, because we have a wider set of people who can review those journals in their native languages. So it is different from those databases. They are strict in their criteria, like we are, but their criteria are generally different. And we look at the open access adherence, I think, a lot more than they do. You'll probably find other open access databases out there that do include predatory journals, and we try very, very hard to keep predatory journals out of DOAJ.
Question coming up about that a little bit later. And just to add that African Journals Online AJOL does require metadata in English from our journal partners, which are publishing in other languages. We also have Arabic and French and Kiswahili and Portuguese and Hausa and all sorts of different languages, but we require the abstract and the keywords for the articles, article titles, and so on, to be provided to us in English as well. And that's for the purposes of making the journal more internationally discoverable, as well as for our ease of assessment. We don't have as many assessors in different languages as the DOAJ does. There's a follow-up question about what are the advantages of DOAJ over others. And is there any financial requirement? I would just jump in straight away and say AJOL encourages journals to be on multiple platforms and multiple indexing services, because each has a potentially different audience from a different part of the world or a different group of experts. So it adds value to be to put the effort into being on multiple indexing services or platforms. Judith, the full question is, what are the advantages of the DOAJ over others? And is there any financial requirement from the journal at any point prior to or after the success of an application to you?
Well, there are no financial requirements whatsoever. We assess journals and we index journals without any charge. Most of our income comes from the support of libraries and consortia, and we do get some funding from some of the commercial publishers, but the majority of our funding is from libraries. So we don't expect journals to have to pay to be considered. I think that would be unfair, particularly as we want to be encouraging journals that work in a sustainable, low cost way. So yeah, please don't worry that there's ever going to be a cost. And in the main advantage, I think, to be indexed, as Susan says, is that your journal will be seen by different people in different parts of the world. If you are able to supply metadata for articles to DOAJ once your journal is indexed, then that metadata will be sent to OCLC and EBSCO and Clarivate and ProQuest and all those services where people pay money to implement those services, and your articles would actually be in there for no cost to you. So somebody, say in a university in the US, will be looking at a particular search, and they'll see some articles that are relevant, that are perhaps from your journal, and they would have a system that tells them where they can get that content from, and it would link back to DOAJ, which would then lead that user to the full text on your own journal. So I think it's one of the really useful things about our metadata is that it's really widely used, and I hope that you would get the experience of the editor of the physics journal I mentioned, that he's received papers from people in other parts of the world that perhaps wouldn't have seen his journal before.
Right, 100%. We get similar feedback at AJOL. I'm just going to say we have been going for a full hour now. We started the webinar at 3 minutes past the hour, and we've been going. Is Judith available to continue answering some very interesting questions that are still waiting?
I can answer a few more questions, of course.
Thank you so much. And anybody else who's leaving for another commitment, thank you for joining us today. And the recording of the entire webinar will be shared in a couple of days once it's all processed and neatened up, and will be available on AJOL's YouTube channel. So continuing to the next question, good presentation. Is there a fast track process for journals that already run on OJS and are also on AJOL?
That's also a very good question. There isn't a fast track process, but we are looking at journals that are on AJOL, and in some cases, I think we will be considering actually inviting people to submit applications. I think there's a good reason for us to be working with AJOL, and if you want to be indexed in DOAJ, then I think we can, I hope, even if we don't fast track those, if something is part of a particular project or an area where we want to encourage journal applications, then we will really try and handle those in good time. So it may not necessarily be fast track, but we would certainly be trying to help that kind of journal in order to be indexed in DOAJ.
And I can bear witness to that, because Judith and I have been working together for many years, paying special attention to journals coming out of Africa from our side of things. Quick question to answer, hopefully. Does the DOAJ expect applicants to be members of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics?
No, we don't. We expect that you should have some processes for handling issues around publication ethics, but we don't expect people to be members of COPE, and we don't check as part of our review process. We may check if we think a journal is predatory and they say they're members of COPE, we might check then, but we're not very likely to check most journals.
Great. Then the question I warned you that was coming up, Judith, what do you consider a predatory journal?
Again, an excellent question. And there is a kind of wide spectrum of kind of predatory characteristics, but we and that kind of comes from, there's the low quality journals where we feel that the peer review processes are not very good. There isn't a robust peer review process. Something that's clearly predatory is where a journal is perhaps pretending to be something that it isn't. So we have recently looked at a publisher where, they had the American Journal of something and the British Journal of something else and the Asian Journal of something else, none of which had any relationship with the geographic areas that they were supposed to represent. We look at an organization perhaps that says it's in the US, but actually is somewhere else. It's about honesty and transparency. If a journal is not working in a way that we feel is honest. So, for instance, they say there are no fees, but we get reports from people who have published with them, and they said, "Well, we've been charged a fee afterwards." That is a very predatory characteristic. So, from our point of view, there are the kind of worst offenders of predatory journals, and we try and exclude those for quite a long time from DOAJ. And there are then ones that are a little bit more where we feel that the processes are not as good as they could be, but they're not predatory. It's more of an issue with quality. In one case that I dealt with, we did remove a journal because we felt that it was predatory, but actually it was a journal that had grown too much too quickly. They weren't able to cope with the number of papers that they were getting, and they had to rethink their entire processes. So and that was an area where they got somebody in to help them to fix that, and they actually had some supporters who said, this is not a predatory journal, but they were kind of, their processes had become less than adequate. So it's as I say, it's a really big bucket that you can say predatory. You can put lots of things in, but there's a huge range from the very, very bad to the just not doing things the right way.
Thanks, Judith. It is always a difficult and very grey area to decide what is the challenge that this particular journal is facing in terms of is it deliberately putting these practices in place that are signaling that it is a problematic or a fake journal or a predatory journal, or is it because it's being published by a group of subject specialists who aren't aware that they are coming across as such and need to be more familiar with the standards of publishing, journal publishing practices that are signaling good quality and robust review and assessment of the content that is published by that journal. So yeah, always a good question to spend a juicy chat on.
And I think that's a really good point, Susan, that often there's circumstances, and the key thing is, if something is truly predatory, is that they're deliberately either hiding information or providing incorrect information. The other thing is journals that are publishing papers that are no good, or papers that are out of scope for the money. We had a journal that was, I think it was a medical journal of some kind, that was in DOAJ and it was fine. It then got sold to somebody else And then we got reports of this journal publishing in all kinds of subjects when it was a very focused, its title was a very focused element of medicine. So you knew at that point that it had gone from a perfectly good journal to a predatory journal. And that was quite quite instructive that, you know, just because a journal was good in the past doesn't mean it's going to stay that way.
We've unfortunately had experience of similar things where journals publishing from Africa have actually paid big publishers, big commercial publishers for hosting, just so that they're associated with the name. They're not actually published by that commercial overseas entity. And they can't afford to carry on paying those hosting fees, and they get into debt, and they have to sell the journal on, and it's bought by a predatory publisher, and then we have to suspend them. So sadly, don't fall for that. Particularly happens in the medical field. I am going to jump to the last question and go back to the second last question, because I think that will have a longer answer. If accepted, can a journal leave the DOAJ anytime it wishes to? Are there any costs or re-entry implications for that journal?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think anyone has ever asked to leave DOAJ. A journal can leave, for instance, if the journal. So we will take a journal out if it ceases publishing. We might take a journal out, as we've discussed already, because it doesn't meet the criteria anymore. I don't think we've ever had anyone say, please don't index us anymore. The only example I can think of is again related to the takeover of a journal by a predatory editor, where the editor-in-chief actually came to us and said, please take my journal out of DOAJ because the publisher is forcing me to publish special issues that I have nothing to do with. And so that was, again, quite a surprise. But we investigated those claims of the editor-in-chief, and we did take that journal out. But I suppose in theory, a journal can ask to be delisted. I'm not sure why they'd want to. There aren't any cost implications, but I guess they'd have to wait 6 months to come back in as any other journal would.
Thanks, Judith. And then the last question in our Q&A box before I open for other discussion. Does the DOAJ have any guidelines or advice, in fact, on artificial intelligence as relates to journal publications?
Again, an excellent question. It is something it's not in our criteria at the moment. We are considering what to add to our criteria with regard to the AI policy for journals. So I think at the moment, the only things that we've said specifically are that you can't credit an AI tool as an author, so you can't have ChatGPT as an author of your paper. And we have said that to journals that have applied. I mean, our criteria are basically about the policies that you have. So we don't tend to say what your policies have to be. But I'm looking at our internal document where we are talking about what we should add to our criteria. And at the moment, we're talking about things like the journal should state its policy on the use of AI by authors and reviewers and editors, and authors should be required to disclose the use of AI in their papers. So that is really where we're at the moment, and that's something that we will be working on in order to add something into our criteria. But I think if you are editing a journal, have a look at the guidance that's been put out already by different publishing bodies. Get something in your author guidelines to say what you want authors to disclose in terms of their AI use. If there are the options of using any services to detect AI that's been used for bad purposes, I suspect that's probably more of an issue in the commercial world, where they've had really bad experiences with paper mills. I suspect that's more for them than it is for smaller journals. But just be aware of all the developments and keep monitoring things. We're monitoring things, and we will hopefully have something to add to our criteria soon.
AJOL is in exactly the same position. We are undertaking an assessment of our implementation over the last few years during the next couple of months. And then we're going to be updating the criteria for the JPPS framework, which is not an in or out system. It is kind of an incremental system that comes out of the assessment process for AJOL to indicate to readers and authors and librarians which publishing practices and standards a journal is currently implementing. We haven't updated those for a very long time, and artificial intelligence has become something obviously that we need to address during those years, and we are also working on guidelines in that regard. Just to note that currently the AI detection tools are really useless, so don't waste money on those. Perhaps in future they will develop something that is more useful in that regard, but for now, no. Right. I'm not terribly familiar with this system in terms of being able to answer questions live now, but that's the end of our written Q&A. Questions that came through during the course of Judith's excellent presentation. If there is anybody, earlier on we had a couple of raised hands that I saw that I didn't answer, and I asked people to type their questions into the chat or into the Q&A. Hopefully we've covered everything and all the burning questions. If there is anybody else who would like to ask something, you may unmute yourself or raise your hand now. I'll just give a little minute or two for people to find the right icons to be able to do that if they're trying to.
If anyone has any questions that they think of afterwards, or they'd rather not ask in person, then you can email me if you have some queries. So I'm just judith@doaj.org. So you can email me if you think of something later.
Wonderful. Oh, there's a hand up from Abdul Kabir. Please do unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I joined the presentation lately, but I'm so concerned about I don't know whether the question has been covered during the presentation or not. So permit me if I repeat it. We have many journals. I'm calling from Nigeria, by the way. So we have many journals. Some of them are biannual, published twice a year, and many others are published annually. I'm wondering if somebody wants to index the journal, want to apply for indexing in your database, the rest of our open access journal. Is it possible for annual journal to be indexed, or it has to be at least The journal must publish at least twice a year.
No, we have journals that are annual. As you missed the beginning, you probably missed the criterion that we only ask for a journal to be publishing 5 research articles per year. So we do accept quite small journals, and we do accept annual journals as well.
That's good. So how can we have access to your the conditions for admission to the database? I believe you have it online, right?
Yes, we do. Yes. So we have a guide to applying, which I'll just put the link in the chat. Let me just do that now. So yeah, there's a,
Yes.
I put that in the chat. So that should give you the details of all of the criteria that we are looking at. And if you have any questions, then just let us know.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
And from AJOL's perspective, I can underscore the need for reading that guide very carefully and being sure to have answered all of the, understood clearly what the criteria are in the application form and have answered it in full, because that is the single thing that speeds up the assessment process the most. So if in doubt, read the instructions. Are there any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to call the, okay, right. I'm opening a queue. I'm going to call the meeting to a close. Peter Nar, would you like to unmute yourself and speak? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask, yeah, is there any umbrella body to check the credibility of indexing of organizations? My journal has had a request from a number of indexing organizations to submit our journal. So is there any way we can check, which indexing organizations are credible and in good standing? Thank you.
That's another really excellent question. There are quite a lot of indexing services that offer what they call impact factors. And certainly from the DOAJ perspective, we don't consider those are reputable indexers. So one of the things that we very much recommend is that you don't quote any impact factors that are not the well-known one from Clarivate. So I think that's a rule of thumb. If they say they publish an impact factor, then we wouldn't consider them to be a service that you should get involved with. But I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think that there's an umbrella body or a definitive list of which services are good or not. I mean, I think Jeffrey Beale used to have a list in the same way as he had a list of predatory journals, but I'm always aware of the fact that that was a one man's opinion as opposed to anything else.
I think that perhaps the commercial product that has taken over, offering a blacklist of journals called Cabel's, might have a section on predatory or fake indexes as well. I'm not sure, but if in doubt, another rule of thumb is if you're asked to pay a fee by some indexing service, that is very dubious. So rather avoid any indexing service that is not something that is familiar to you, and particularly if they ask for money from you. Thanks.
Yeah, again, a really good point. Yes.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today, for your very active participation, and mostly to Judith for a superb presentation and really insightful answers to the questions asked. We are now going to end the webinar, and the recording should be available in a couple of days. Many
Thanks
thanks all.
everybody. And thanks for your great questions.